Chapter 9 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. Section 4. Progress of the Mother Church. 98. While Christianity was expanding in the regions beyond Judea, the church in Jerusalem gradually recovered from the blow of persecution. We cannot say how long the persecution lasted. The first notice of its cessation is in Acts 9, verse 31, but it is impossible to date that statement with precision. We may believe that the fury of the persecution lasted but a year or two, and that with the conversion of Paul, it lost its chief instigator. 99. Its cessation was followed by a renewed growth of the Christian community. The disciples again appear carrying on their work in public. Peter is represented as preaching in towns of Syria, Acts 9, verses 32 through 42, and on his return, meeting the assembled church in Jerusalem, Acts 11, verse 2. Some years later, the disciples formed a sufficiently large and well-known element of the population to cause Herod Agrippa I to seek to please the Jews by renewing persecution. 100. The hostility of the authorities and the spread of the faith had, however, the effect of separating the disciples from the synagogues and leading them to form a complete organization of their own. They were indeed still loyal to the temple and the law. The charge which had been brought against Stephen, Acts 6, verse 13, did not represent a change in the attitude of the disciples as a body to the national worship, but separation from the synagogues had, in many cases, been forced upon them. And even though this may not have always been the case, the necessity for the further organization of their community had become apparent. We have already noted the separation among the disciples in the dispersion, section 70. We now find it in Judea. Mention is made of the elders, Acts 11, verse 30, of Jerusalem, a phrase which implies that the disciples of the capital were organized into a religious society, perhaps into several, modeled after the synagogue. The same was true of those in other towns of Judea, Galatians 1, verse 20. The name synagogue was retained for the Christian assembly, James 2, verse 2, or at the same time the term ecclesia was also used to denote the society itself, James 5, verse 14. The latter term was already familiar as a designation of the congregation of Israel through its use in the Septuagint, compare Acts 7, verse 38. It, or its Aramaic equivalent, had been used by Jesus himself to denote the company of his disciples, Matthew 16, verse 18, and Matthew 18, verse 17. Its meaning, too, a body called out, doubtless contributed to its use by suggesting the divine call to which believers had responded, while the advantage of having a distinct name for the new society was obvious. Ecclesia became eventually the regular term used among the Christians, except by a few ultra-Jewish Christian sects, and is employed by Luke to denote the body of disciples from the beginning, Acts 5, verse 11, etc. Yet the new organization was simply the transfer of Jewish forms to the new society. As we have seen that before the persecution, practical necessity led to the erection of the eleemosynary office of the seven, and as thus the inherent power of the community to organize itself was exhibited. So now, the time had come when complete organization was required for the independent welfare of the church. 101. Thus must be explained the origin of the Christian office of elder. No specific account of its institution is given. We simply find it existing. But there can be no question that it was copied from the office of the same name among the Jews. In each Jewish community, the elders were the governing body. The time had doubtless passed when only old men filled the office, and the elders were chosen from among the most influential. Originally, they possessed both civil and religious authority, but oftener, in the time of which we are treating, their authority pertained chiefly to religious matters, except in those foreign cities where civil jurisdiction was granted by the government to the rulers of the Jewish colonies. The Jewish elders were thus the representatives and rulers of the congregation which assembled in the synagogue. They exercised discipline even to excommunication, and managed in general the affairs of the synagogue. There were also other officers particularly charged with the house meeting, such as the ruler or rulers of the synagogue, who provided for the actual conduct of worship by securing readers and speakers, the minister, Jason, who cared for the sacred writings and performed other duties under the direction of his superiors, and the receivers of alms, who, however, were not strictly officers of the synagogue, while the eldership constituted the chief synagogal authority. Where more than one synagogue existed in a place, all the elders seemed to have formed one body governing the entire community. Finally, the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, consisting of 71 members, besides being the governing body of Judea, was the supreme court of the Jewish church and world. 102. When, then, we find the disciples organized under elders, the origin and character of the arrangement is evident. The eldership was not primarily a teaching office. Its functions were chiefly disciplinary and executive. As in the synagogue, anyone was at liberty to read or speak. So in the early churches there was freedom of utterance, and the gifts of the Spirit supplied the needs of the worshippers. Compare 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26. The elders, however, presided. They could teach if they wished, and the superintendence of the instructions, as well as of the order of the congregation, was in their hands. Of course, they possessed no priestly functions. As the synagogue was distinct from the temple, so the object of its service was instruction, not sacrifice, and those who ruled in either synagogue or church had none of the functions of those who officiated at the altar. In conformity with the synagogal origin of the office, we find Christian elders first mentioned as receiving the gifts from Antioch for distribution among the poor, Acts 11, verse 30, as appointed by Paul and Barnabas over the new churches in Asia Minor, Acts 14, verse 23, and as uniting with the apostles in the council at Jerusalem, Acts 15, verses 6, 22, and 23. It is probable that in Judea, as elsewhere, Acts 14, verse 23, and Acts 20, verse 17, in each locality where a sufficient number of disciples existed, elders were chosen who governed the entire body of believers in that place. Certainly in Jerusalem, where there were many disciples, and doubtless many places of meeting, there was one body of elders ruling over all, Acts 11, verse 30, and Acts 15, verse 6. Whether any other features of the synagogue were taken over, we do not know. But by the establishment of the Christian eldership, two facts are made clear, namely, that the separation from Judaism had become decided, and that the primitive conception of the church was not based on the temple, but on the synagogue, where the congregation met for instruction, praise, and prayer. 103. The rise of organized churches seems to also have modified gradually the work performed by the apostles. At first, they had been the sole officials. With the appointment of the 7, they were relieved of the care of the poor, that they might attend undividedly to teaching. With the establishment of the eldership, their work was further modified. No doubt it was they who directed the organization into churches on the same practical principles which appear in the institution of the 7. They still continue to be the recognized authorities in matters of belief. Example, 1 Corinthians 9, verse 1, 1 Corinthians 12, verse 23, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 13, Ephesians 2, verse 20, Ephesians 4, verse 11, and Jude 17. But they now appear more and more to have directed their efforts to the superintendence and advancement of the cause at large. So Peter's activity, quite early in this period, is expressly described, Acts 9, verse 32. So too had Paul, as we have seen, been sent forth to Cilicia. From this time we hear no more of most of the original apostles. We cannot doubt that they went abroad, as tradition affirms, as missionaries and founders of new churches, and that to them, as well as to other laborers, the spread of Christianity was due. Jerusalem indeed continued for many years to be the headquarters of the faith, and to it they may have returned, like Paul himself, from time to time. But the progress and organization of the Judean churches appears to have delocalized the apostolate and made it a traveling and scattered body, delivering in wider circles the gospel of the risen Lord. Compare 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5. 104. One event during this period illustrates particularly how the mother church was prepared to appreciate the expansion of the faith that was beginning. Acts chapter 10. Cornelius, a Roman centurion of the Italian cohort located in Caesarea, belonged to the numerous class of devout foreigners who had come under the influence of Judaism. He worshipped Jehovah and was constant in alms and prayers. This man was directed in a vision to send for Peter, who was sojourning in Joppa, that he might learn the will of the Lord more perfectly. The apostle was also given a significant vision. While waiting at noon on the housetop for food to be prepared, he beheld in an ecstasy a sheet let down from heaven, filled with beasts, creeping things, and fowls, and he heard a voice saying, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." When he protested that he had never eaten unclean food, the voice replied, "What God hath cleansed, make not thou common." Acts 10, verse 15, Revised Version. A second and a third time the vision was repeated, and while Peter pondered on its meaning, the messengers from Cornelius arrived. The Spirit bade him go with them, and Peter realized that the vision and the summons were divinely connected. Probably he had never before doubted the binding force of Jewish ordinances, but he knew now that he must not limit his mission by them. When, then, he reached the house of Cornelius and heard the cause of the summons, he did not hesitate to preach Jesus to the Gentiles who were present and to offer them salvation on condition of faith alone. Acts 10, verse 43. At once the Spirit fell upon the company, to the astonishment of the Jewish Christians who accompanied the apostle. That signified God's acceptance of uncircumcised believers. Peter recognized the divine will, and without more delay baptized the new disciples. He even continued to live with them, in disregard of Jewish regulations, for certain days. 105. This incident was felt to be revolutionary. The news spread to Jerusalem, and while the conversion of Gentiles could not but cause joy, the conduct of Peter in living and eating with them offended the brethren. When he returned, they took him to task for it. He replied by rehearsing the facts, closing with the unanswerable question, "What was I that I could withstand God?" Acts 11, verses 1 through 17. He evidently felt that since God had accepted Gentile believers without circumcision, he dared not refuse to recognize them as brethren in the Lord, even at the cost of the violation of ceremonial customs. And if he reflected on the words, "What God hath cleansed, make not thou common," he could hardly have failed to perceive that he was meant to understand that the work of Jesus consisted in the cleansing from all sin, and that on this basis the whole Mosaic ritual, its purpose having been accomplished, was no longer necessary. Whether he perceived this at the time or not, it was made clear to him that God did not intend the ritual law to be imposed on Gentiles. 106. This incident shows that the relation of Gentile believers, and ultimately of all believers, to Judaism was a subject on which, as Christianity expanded, there was certain to be difference of opinion. Hitherto, it had been generally assumed that Gentile converts would observe the law, while, as to the duty of Jews, there was no doubt. Peter himself ventured to transgress the ordinances only after explicit direction from the Lord, and all that we know of the early Jewish believers makes it certain that nothing but belief in a revelation to that effect could have led the apostle so to act. Hence, the incident was remembered in after times as a demonstration of what the will of the Lord was. Its effect on Peter can be seen in his whole subsequent career. He ever afterwards maintained the freedom of Gentiles from the law. Acts 15, verses 7 through 11, Galatians 2, verses 7 and 8. And, though he was the apostle of the circumcision, we find him in Antioch living freely with them. Galatians 2, verse 12. The church in Jerusalem also recognized that at least God had granted to the Gentiles repentance unto life. Acts 11, verse 18. Though their disapproval of Peter's conduct may not have wholly ceased, and though all may not have been ready to apply the principle involved, this is not inconsistent with the rise afterward, when the number of uncircumcised believers had increased, of a party who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. The manifest work of God silenced the voice of prejudice, and, as the incident became more significant in light of later controversy, so at the time it indicated the larger field on which the faith was entering. 107. Thus, Christianity advanced in Judea after the cessation of the first persecution. It was recruited chiefly, as the poverty of the disciples seemed to prove, Galatians 2, verse 10, from the humbler classes. Not a few, however, of the Pharisees joined them, Acts 15, verse 5, for the loyalty of the disciples to the law was unquestionable. In many respects, the movement still appeared a spiritual revival of Judaism, and appealed powerfully to the religious aspirations of the best of the people. And this condition of affairs was hardly interrupted by the brief revival of persecution by Herod Agrippa I, Acts 12. That prince, the grandson of Herod the Great and brother of Herodias, who married Herod Antipas, after a checkered career in Rome and the East, had been given by his friend Gaius Caligula on the latter's accession to the empire in AD 37, the tetrarchies of Ituraea, Trachonitis, and Abilene with the title of king, and to these were added, in AD 40, Galilee and Perea, which had formerly been governed by Herod Antipas. Claudius, in AD 41, confirmed this grant and added to it Judea and Samaria, which, since the death of Archelaus, had been ruled by procurators. Herod Agrippa was thus king of the Jews and governed the same territory as his famous grandfather. His reign lasted but 3 years. He was popular with the Jews, and, when in Judea, observant of their customs. It was quite in accord with what we know of his character that, to please the Jews, he instituted persecution against the new sect. This was in AD 44, the year of Herod's death. James, son of Zebedee, was slain with a sword. Only a divine interposition saved Peter, who, after sending word of his escape to James, the Lord's brother, and to the other leaders, fled from the city. No mention, however, is made of other seizures by Herod. Peter's language, Acts 12, verse 17, has been thought to imply that the other apostles had also left the city, and, even apart from the danger which threatened them, this may have been the case. But the trouble appears to have soon blown over. Herod died in the summer of that year in Caesarea under strangely dramatic circumstances, which are described independently, but with agreement as to the main facts by Josephus and Luke. Luke chapter 12, verses 20 through 23. The only significance of the persecution was its indication of the determined rejection of Christianity by the Jewish state as well as by the Jewish church. However loyal to Judaism the disciples might be, they could not but realize that the separation between them and the existing authorities was complete. End of chapter 9.